So thank you. My name is Lee Brenner. I will say I actually have a connection, well, besides the fact that I went to school in Somerville, not far from here. The reason I'm actually involved in blockchain is because one of the original directors of the blockchain lab here at MIT Media Lab, Brian Ford, was living with me while he was running it. So for years, he's the one who actually got me connected to it. Unfortunately, at the time, I didn't invest all of my money in Bitcoin. But alas, I'm involved with it now. But I've had most of my career in civic technology and thinking about how technology intertwines with politics, public affairs, and social impact. So I'm currently working with the Global Blockchain Business Council, which I'll talk to you about in a little bit about what it does and what we're doing. But I'm trying to come at this from a perspective of how can blockchain be used for good? How can blockchain technology help the 2+ billion people who aren't necessarily involved in traditional infrastructures, in the financial structure, in insurance, all the industries that we're potentially talking about, who aren't necessarily connected to the internet right now? How can we lift them out of poverty? How are these big questions going to be answered using technology? So as I mentioned, I worked in civic technology. I started in the news world. I worked at CNN for many years. Then I worked at a company called MySpace. Who still has their MySpace page? Good for you. And really worked on their social impact initiatives. And the idea was how that world, social media, was going to be impacting politics and public affairs and nonprofits, and how that aspect has worked. And we've seen how those have grown. I then moved into my own startup world, and I created and hosted a radio show called Politics Powered by Twitter. And we can see that was back in 2012, and we know that's all worked out perfectly, and Twitter and politics is melded into one. So, but the idea of trust amongst all these networks, and part of the reason that I think blockchain is in existence, is that trust has been eroding, and only 15%, according to this year's Edelman Trust Barometer, 15% of people trust institutions to work for them. So that, I think, comes from the idea that so many of our current institutions aren't working for the masses. So potential of blockchain, we've been talking about this all day, so I don't need to go through all of it. The idea is that it has the ability to repair trust and promote sustainability, and we've talked about audits and controls and governance and protection of sensitive data. But what we're trying to do at the Global Blockchain Business Council is from a perspective of the ecosystem and the industry, and representing the companies that are either working in blockchain technology or those major companies from industries where they're exploring blockchain technology, representing to advocate for the blockchain industry, educate those folks on what the potential is by using actual case studies, and then really talking to regulators around the world about what the potential is for their societies and what the technology can do to impact their own citizens, whether the government is going to use it for their own e-governance, and whether we're talking about land titling and some of the other things we'll talk about, or whether they're going to potentially implement some sort of regulation, again, whether that's for currencies or the blockchain technologies in and of themselves. We want to make sure that those regulators are aware of what the basics of the technology are. They don't necessarily need to know the basics of the technology, but they need to know how it's going to affect them. They understand that email is important, but they don't necessarily need to know the protocols. And I think we recognized recently during the Facebook hearings, the members of our elected offices here in the United States are very obviously behind. But if we can at least educate them on the basics of the potential of the technology, I think that'll help build up the ecosystem for everybody. So we do that through advocacy, through education, and then building partnerships. And one of the aspects of partnerships is to see how these companies can come together, work within public and private institutions, and then try to create projects that ideally can help the most amount of people. So again, going back to that question, how can blockchain technology help the most vulnerable of those global citizens? There's people all around the world who don't have bank accounts, who don't have credit, who don't have access to their energy grids, who don't have the ability to get aid or aren't getting food. How can this technology potentially access different resources and give them the ability to rise out of their circumstances? So we go around and talk to governments, whether there's large governments, the European Union, the United States government, China, and meet with people. Then we're talking to smaller governments too, and especially with this technology, we're recognizing that that governments that are potentially have less infrastructure already built have the ability to utilize blockchain in their institutions for the government as well as throughout their citizenry to make sure it works. So as an example, St. Lucia recently met with them because they're looking at ways that blockchain can be utilized on their island. And one of the ways that we talk about this to government regulators and to business leaders around the world is by using case studies that are actually already implemented or announced at least, and giving them the example as opposed to just theoretical options. So we start with what are the options, what are the questions they need to ask if they want to implement it, whether it's for the government or for a company or an institution. And we don't have to go through all of these, but it's what are the existing solutions that are out there? Why is blockchain technology potentially a solution for the problem that they're trying to solve for? And we go through these questions, making sure that blockchain actually is a solution, because it is not a silver bullet and it's not going to solve every problem in the world. But you've already started to see some headlines out there, bringing it back to my news world, showing some of these options of how blockchain can really affect people, whether it's through pork on the blockchain. With Walmart and IBM are working together on that. Republic of Georgia is developing a blockchain land registry. We talked a little bit about land rights usage. That's actually happened already in certain countries, and you're starting to see more and more countries utilize that. And that, again, gives the rights back to the people who own the land. In Haiti, the building that housed the paperwork that had all the land registries was destroyed. If everything is on paper, and many things are on paper here in the United States, how do you prove who you are? How do you prove that you own a piece of land? By putting that up on a blockchain, you can have that document up there. So you're seeing these headlines come out. You're seeing some projects coming out. We try to use those projects to showcase what the potential is of the technology. So big question: how do we protect the non-financial assets of citizens around the world? Julius, who was here before, is working with one of my colleagues on a company called UN Corp, talking about how do you take assets that people have, whether it's plants, trees, fruit farming, and digitize those assets, whether it's land rights, your home, other things, opposed to just a traditional financial aspect. So Georgia is doing that, as I mentioned, making things a lot simpler for the citizens in that country. How do we secure the safety of the blockchain? Now, that's a traditional business question that you would ask, and Walmart and Unilever also have announced, and they're working on that, and they've talked about different aspects of that. Again, making sure that their supply chain and all the members of their supply chain are working on the same system using smart contracts. But I would go even further. How can we protect then the labor rights of the workers on that supply chain, right? The people that are working all up and down the supply chain, making sure that they are getting paid equitably, making sure that they're getting paid first and foremost, I suppose. And then, as an example, the Coca-Cola Company, the United States Department of State, recently announced a pilot project where they are actually looking to see how they can protect those labor rights of people up and down their supply chain. So that's a place where you're seeing a public-private partnership, and it's a use case where it can actually protect workers' rights, who often are the most vulnerable in these areas. Medical interventions. Around the world, there's people who don't have medical care. Is there a possibility, whether it's health records here in the United States or getting aid to people around the world using these technologies? How do we allow individuals to gain value in their own energy consumption? One of our members and partners, Power Ledger, is talking about that, doing a lot of work in Australia and now here in the United States. They're working potentially, they just announced something in Puerto Rico. Again, allowing people to use their own energy consumption and production using solar technology built on blockchain to distribute that energy kind of off-grid, but also connected to the grid. So they show a value to the traditional power infrastructure as well. Lumens is another great example. They're about to run their ICO. They're trying to work with the most vulnerable citizens in Latin America who aren't even connected to the power lines in their towns, but they can work with IoT devices and building a system on the blockchain where people can use solar power to light up one light bulb in their little shack, and they'll be able to use tokens where people, their family from around the world, can send tokens just to them, just to light up their house for the night, and they can use internet-connected devices to do that. Things like that. The United States government and the Blockchain Trust Accelerator, which is one of our sister organizations, working to help voting technology. Not that there's any problems with voting in the world, but there's a potential there, right? So I'll finish with this, these three big questions that we can think about, because I think it's important to think about these things and the potential of this technology in a broad scale. How do we use blockchain technology to decrease poverty? One example, the World Food Program has announced a blockchain program for distributing that type of aid. How do we use the technology to distribute aid and resources after natural or man-made disasters? As I mentioned, Puerto Rico, and Michael earlier talked about some of the work they're doing in contracting and land. How do we end modern-day slavery? I mean, these are huge questions that we want to make sure that people are thinking about when they're trying to create new companies or major companies that are using blockchain that have the potential to have major influence on these questions are thinking about. So with that, I'll leave you there. Thank you.